How important is the government in determining some of these fertility patterns? Let me give you an example. Sweden is a good case. Sweden's a very modern, developed country, clearly a leader in the world in many respects. And yet, if you compare it to other countries, it actually has high fertility rates. Now, one thing that's different in Sweden is that Sweden has been very aggressive in fostering child care programs and subsidies for parents, parental leave. Do you think that might be something that's going to affect fertility rates?
Absolutely. I think if you look at the Swedish case in the early 1930s, Sweden was one of the low fertility countries of the world. There was a great discussion in Sweden and by demographers about what explains the low Swedish fertility. Gradually, Sweden began to subsidize children. And this took off really in the 70s with two major programs. One, the fact that women who had a job and had children could take a long time off, up to a year to 18 months, and get almost full pay for all that period of time. That's an enormous subsidy. The second was a subsidy for child care activities, public child care facilities that were available to working women. And these had a significant effect. In the 70s, Swedish fertility was about equal to that of Germany's. Since the 70s, Swedish fertility has risen significantly relative to that of Germany, and Sweden has been subsidizing children much more. Now, what will happen in the future? I predict, because of the great concern in European countries and some of the Asian countries about the birth dearth, so to speak, and not enough children, that there will be growing pressure to subsidize children much more significantly in order to overcome this reluctance of parents to have enough children to even replace the populations, let alone have them growing.
When you were a young man, you were often criticized for doing research that was in some sense immoral. Immoral to the extent that economists shouldn't be thinking about these kinds of questions. You often put them in somewhat stark and dramatic terms. Thinking of a child as a consumer durable, for example, didn't necessarily hit everybody well. How important is morality in terms of determining economic analysis? I mean, do you find that when you're doing economic analysis, the morality creeps in?
Well, not directly. I've always been oriented toward what the Germans say verstehen, understanding the world. So my economic analysis, say of children, when I call them a consumer durable, I didn't think I was making a moral statement about that. I was making a statement about, well, this is a way to understand how many children people have, why it's changed over time, why they shift between number of children and investing in the education of children, even why the fertility rates weren't very cyclical, so they declined during bad times, but not so much. And I used a durable argument to explain why that was so. So to me, it was a way of understanding behavior, and that was true in any of the problems that I work with. Family issues more generally, understanding divorce, assuming that men and women maximize, why I like polygamy as a system, why I didn't think it hurt women. These were attempts to understand. Now, it's been my strong belief that you cannot engage in normative policy prescriptions about what we should be doing, what government should be doing, unless we understand how the world works. Because every intelligent policy prescription presumes there'll be certain types of responses from those people affected by these policies. And in order to understand these responses, you have to have what we call a positive analysis of how people will respond. And so I think from that point of view, one can go from a positive analysis to a policy analysis, and you base your policy analysis on the positive. So take welfare. If one believes, as I do, that if you weaken the incentives for people to work, if you weaken the incentives for people to have a stable family life, if you weaken the incentives of people to bring up their children in a way that will motivate the children to want to work hard, then you're going to find the consequence. And I think that's what welfare did. The people who advocated welfare policy didn't have what I would say was either any or the correct policy analysis. They assumed either that people don't respond to these things, or that the responses are so negligible it's not worth taking into account. And I think that's where they went wrong. So I think by having a good positive analysis, we were able to be very critical of the traditional welfare program, that we could predict even before it happened that these would be the consequences of introducing a policy of that type. And I think you find the same thing whether take the voluntary army. People thought it was immoral to have a voluntary army. Economists who supported the voluntary army, and I was one of the early supporters of a voluntary army when I was a very young person, wrote a paper about the case against the draft. The argument was that if you went to a voluntary army, you would be able, certainly in most normal times, to attract good quality people at relatively low prices, and that they would be good fighters, and they would be well trained, and it would give you a better armed forces than under the draft. And I think nowadays nobody denies that. You don't hear anybody saying, well, let me check that. You don't hear many people saying we should get rid of the voluntary army. In fact, France and Germany, long holdouts, are now going to a voluntary army, because the system didn't work out for them. Russia is thinking of going to a voluntary army. Well, that's again an issue where issues of morality came. Do you kill patriotism by this? And we discovered you don't kill patriotism. In fact, our army is at least as patriotic as the other armies, maybe no more so, but certainly not less so. They fight well, and they're dedicated. And this comes up in a lot of issues. Should we allow a price mechanism to be used for the purchase of organs for transplants? I'm giving a talk in Germany next week on that issue. I believe we should, because the present system just isn't working. We have long queues and growing queues, people dying, waiting for organ, only because, there's only one reason why that's due. That's because we don't allow any market in kidneys, for example, which is the most common form of transplant. So commodification, yes, but commodification is good if it leads to a more efficient allocation and a more moral outcome. Is it moral to allow people to die because they can't get an organ? To me, that's a highly immoral type of policy, which we're practicing today in the United States.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.